unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Most of our listeners do not need an introduction to the Bollywood superstar Shah Rukh Khan. You've seen his movies, you've sung the songs that his films have popularized, and you might even have had his poster on your wall growing up. A new book by the economist Shrayana Bhattacharya, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, describes another role that Shah Rukh has fulfilled. He has served as the North Star for women across India as they search for love, for agency, and empowerment. This book is part economics primer, part reportage, part social commentary, and part call to arms. It is also an incredibly fun and insightful book to read. Shrayana joins me to talk about her new book from New Delhi. Shrayana, congrats on the book.
Thank you, Milan, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So can I just say, as an aside, you have possibly the best opening line of a book that I've read in recent memory, which reads, "My life has always been heteronormative hell." Which, you know, things can only get more intriguing from there on out. This book is, of course, it's an intimate portrait of women. It's a portrait of society at this point in time. It's a portrait of kind of gender relations of a country where a lot of people are still living in pretty precarious situations and scenarios. But it's also an intimate portrait of yourself, right? You, as the author, are also a character in this book. You're putting yourself out there. You reflect on your personal life, on your loneliness at times, and of course your fandom for Shah Rukh. Tell us about your thoughts, about taking this plunge, because I imagine that, most people would feel some degree of sort of trepidation.
Milan, I have to confess that it wasn't even a decision to make. I think when I was thinking about the book, as you know, it draws on people I met and the stories I heard right from 2006. So these were women I met when I was just a research assistant doing projects on women in the informal economy. So I was in the slums of Ahmedabad, sent to do a survey on the wages and working conditions of incense stick workers. They were making agarbattis at home, earning about a quarter of minimum wage. And these women were fighting for their own economic rights. They were unionizing. They were fighting with employers. They were extremely well aware of their own economic deprivations and realities. They really didn't need an outsider to come in and ask them these questions. And so they were really bored with my questions. And as an icebreaker and just to ease people into conversation, we started talking about our favorite actor. And that's how Shah Rukh came up, because he was so popular. And I started collecting these stories, I think, between 2006 till around 2013. And in 2013, I had two choices, Milan. I had a draft ready, which was a much more academic, distant draft, right? Where essentially I was writing it the way I think a researcher would traditionally write a book about women's labors and women trying to find fun and their interest in a particular actor and masculinity. And somehow, I think in 2013, I myself was going through a fairly hard time in my own personal life, and I write about this in the book. And, there's that great Emily Dickinson poem. She says, if I can at least give comfort to one aching heart, my life is not lived in vain. And I was very motivated with that idea, as lofty as that sounds, because I, at that time, was reading all these women writers. I was reading Vivian Gornick and Emily Witt, and these are all writers who've sort of entered the lives of others through their own personal perspectives. And I found tremendous comfort in that. And I think I also in 2013 realized, while I was immersed in my own heartbreak, reading all these wonderful women writers who really did talk about their own selves as they were writing about the lives of others as well. I also at that stage, Milan, had to go back to many of the women that I had decided to write about and seek permission, right? About whether I was able to write about them, what would they be comfortable with. And at that stage, it just felt really dishonest to write an intimate portrait of other people as a distant observer, with this cool analytical distance between myself and the people I was talking about, because over the years, some of us had actually gone on to be friends somewhat, and we'd be in touch. And so I think sometime around that period of 2013, 2014, I just decided to go back to, start all over again, essentially, take the stories, but write it in a much more personal way. And I think the challenge with that was not in the writing of it, because it felt incredibly liberating, in fact, to write it that way, because my day job requires me to essentially write, the language of a technocrat, and I was liberated from that. But also, I felt that at least by writing the story in a much more personal, intimate way, it would not only make it more accessible for the reader, but I felt I was also being a bit more honest and present as a narrator when I wrote about other people's deeply personal issues and lives and struggles that they were dealing with, that I was present there as well. And that was very important to me.
So I want to ask you to sort of introduce Shah Rukh Khan for our listeners. Most of our listeners are going to be intimately familiar with him, but I'm betting there are a fair number, particularly those who might reside outside of India, who, of course, have heard of him and have a passing knowledge, but might not know him as well as most. In the book, you have this to say. You say, from the drawing rooms of Jor Bagh to the forests of Jharkhand, across diverse classes and communities, Shah Rukh Khan appears as recourse in many teary-eyed moments triggered by the drudgery and ignominy of being a woman in modern India, which is a pretty powerful statement. Tell us about who SRK, as he's known, is as a kind of person and as an icon.
Milan, first I have to just confess that it's very difficult for me to treat him as an analytical object. I for reasons that, I think I'm very transparent about in the book, which is that I'm just a nutty fan. And so, it's difficult for me to be unbiased. And so I am hopelessly biased. But having said that, I was fortunate through the course of the book. As you read, I interviewed a bunch of film writers and critics and even producers who are far more independent in their observations than perhaps I am when it comes to Mr. Khan. And I think based on those conversations, and then obviously the stories that I've heard over the past decade, I think there are three things that are really salient when it comes to him and what he means, not only to the women in the book, but I think to the broader narrative on sort of post-liberalization India. And I think the first is, if you see the kinds of roles that he's done, right from, the dangerous stalker who's actually actively harming women, then straight into, lovers who are always, have wide open arms, are extremely considerate and kind to the women and they love and their mothers and sisters and so on. And to the more recent roles where he's actually been playing somewhat narcissistic men who are extremely worried about being dwarfed by very important and confident women who have higher social status than him. If you look at these sort of three phases of his career, the one thing that's very apparent is that he's always been very vulnerable on screen. And it's a kind of masculinity that I think, Anupama Chopra in the book said to me that, it was a masculinity that we as an Indian audience had never seen before. Because, he was in the kitchen, he found masculine strength in actually talking about his feelings. And I think what's really important in understanding Mr. Khan's persona on screen as well as off screen is that kindness, a certain gentle masculinity that he's embodied through his career. And it's very different, Milan, if you contrast that with, say, a Salman Khan or an Amir Khan, because, Salman's icon is one of brash, hyper-masculine confidence, that the man who will beat everybody up and is a show of strength in a very traditional stoic way. And Amir's his characters and his icon is one essentially of, what we call the perfectionist. He sort of picks really good roles and great scripts. And I think his icon tends to adhere to very traditional notions of what an actor should be, right? So if you compare these three men who really, I think, defined popular culture in India very significantly over the past 30 years, Shah Rukh really stands out as a very different masculine ideal. So I think that's the one thing that's really important. The second, Milan, is that he's also essentially a bearer of liberalization. So remember that he came onto the scene in 1992, right around the time economic reforms took off, and particularly telecom reforms were set in place. And as a consequence, he was the first icon we had who essentially could be on television day and night. I mean, you could come back home, and I write about this, particularly among sort of English-speaking fans and the upper middle class and elite fans. You could come back home and you would have a satellite television channel, which didn't exist before, Milan. And you could see Shah Rukh on the TV doing an interview. And he was able to relay his icon and his celebrity in a way and have it disseminated through these multiple modes of TV and network news that icons of the past never had. And I think that's a very important story. And also the fact that he came onto the scene with market reform. So suddenly there were beverages that needed to be advertised and lots of cars that needed to be advertised. And he was the face of that. And as you know, Milan, in the book, I actually say that, many fans who are English speaking may call him a post-liberalization superstar, our first post-liberalization superstar. But for many women who don't even understand words like GDP or don't know anything about, Mr. Manmohan Singh's reforms, Shah Rukh was liberalization for them because his face was plastered all over, their cities and towns and villages, drinking a Pepsi or advertising something or the other. And to them, that image was signal to them that something had deeply changed in the country. So I think that's the second, which is he's very much the bearer of India's market reform story. And the third, I think, is, he has always played, even if you compare him with the other Khans, he's always played far more Muslim figures. So he's always taken on very challenging roles, be it Chakve India, you look at Rais. He's always been showing us very diverse facets of the Indian Muslim experience. And I think these three ideas around him really define him, which is a different kind of masculinity, a deep comment and engagement with the Indian Muslim experience, and also the bearer and in a way just the person who advertised and announced India's post-liberalization phase. I think to me and to the stories I hear and to the people I've interviewed, these three attributes really define his icon.
I just want to sort of summarize what you said with a very pithy quote, which a fan gave you back in 2016, where she said, "I've developed a simple test to detect misogyny in any Indian, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani man. If a man likes Shah Rukh, he's usually progressive. If a man likes Salman, he's bad news. If a man likes Amir, he's often a bearded liberal who likes his own voice too much. Yep. My test rarely fails," which I thought was like such a amazing kind of, sort of insight. One thing you say in the book, and I just kind of want to push you a little bit to help me understand sort of what the difference is. You say that Shah Rukh isn't a feminist icon, but he's certainly a female one. What is the kind of distinction you're making there?
Milan, it's also a distinction that I heard constantly being made by his female fans as well, and many of the people I spoke to, which is that, we have to acknowledge that there is an early part of his career where he played roles these were men who were actively stalking, harming women. I write about these characters that they were, in a way, I think, announcing the arrival of the South Asian incel in a way. These were all men who were very, who really didn't believe that a woman had her own subjectivity or her own voice, but the woman only existed to essentially trigger some form of desire or lust in the man. And that was the only role that these women played. And you can't ignore that part of his iconography and his filmography. And it did trigger, various forms of behavior. I think the way he would speak to women on the phone, in one of his famous films, Dar, calling and speaking to women a certain way. I think many young women told me who were fans of his that many men would actually behave with them exactly the same way and they would feel unsafe about it. And so I think we can't distance his icon from that part of his films, and which is why I think many of the women I spoke to were very uncomfortable, claiming him as a feminist icon because of that past. And even in the films, in fact, where he's playing, the lover, and who is a considerate lover, many fans, particularly, again, sort of upper middle class English-speaking fans, would often say to me, well, even in those roles, he essentially mirrors a very, the benevolent patriarch, right? And there's a deep adherence to tradition, certainly in films like DDLJ, where, he refuses to run away with his lover because he'd rather have the father give approval, right? And I think seeing all of those aspects, the certain religiosity in his movies, the way the movies also obviously glamorized a certain kind of wealth. Seeing all of that, it's difficult to I think, use the label of feminist with his icon, and certainly the fans that I spoke to were very uncomfortable doing so, particularly of a certain class group. And yet, the same women would watch him in a dar and be very uncomfortable with it, Milan, and yet celebrate the love and comfort and intelligence and insight that he's provided in his other movies, in his interviews, certainly, which are off, not on screen, but, on your television screen or now on your mobile phone. And he's a female icon because he's provided a certain, again, as I said in the beginning, a certain kind of masculine ideal about what kind of support can men provide women. When women are feeling taxed by society for defying norms. In the book, it's one of the key norms that many of the women are essentially defying is that they choose to continue working and holding on to a job outside the home, which in many families, as you can tell from the stories in the book, is a very challenging thing for women to be able to do. And many of these women just loved Mr. Khan because they felt that he loved women. He would celebrate women's choices to work, to rest, to choose to do what they want to do with their own bodies and hearts and minds. And I think that's why he's a female icon. But given certain parts of his filmography, it's difficult to classify his icon as feminist. I think that's the distinction I was trying to make.
One of the hardest parts of the book to read was the chapter on your one-time love interest, who you called the One. It was hard to read, not because of the writing, but because of the way that the One treated you. And I want to ask you about him. But before that, maybe ask you a little bit about the Delhi social scene, right? So you say at one point that for all the single women that I know, dating in Delhi feels like an incessant confrontation with one's worst insecurities and inadequacies. And lamenting about one's romantic mishaps becomes a part-time job in the city. So before kind of delving into the character of their One, could you set up a little bit the sort of Delhi social scene? If you're kind of putting on your anthropologist hat, how would you describe it?
Well, actually, you know what? Let's start with the economist hat, Milan, because I think there's this very interesting economics of the Delhi drawing room. And I think I delve into it a little bit in the chapter right up in the beginning on a character called Vidya. She's a IIT-IIM product. And, one of the things I realized...
And you guys met in a cinema hall, right?
Yes, that's right.
At the end of a show, you didn't know her.
Yeah. No, I did not know her. Shah Rukh, I actually say this, I say that Shah Rukh introduced her to me. And in fact, one of the things, and this is exactly going back to this idea of the economics of the Delhi drawing room, Delhi's a really small city, despite being a city of 21 million people. And what I mean by that is the network effects in Delhi are such that if you've gone to a certain school, in all likelihood, your closest friends, even at the age of 40, as I mentioned in the chapter on the One, are still men you went to school with. Like, that's still your core group, which I think would also be true for other cities of the world. But it's particularly acute in Delhi because it seems like many people's social lives almost ended there. And then you accumulate a few friends here and there, but it's an extremely segregated society. So I actually say in the book that a city of 21 million people feels like 21 people because you just keep seeing the same people constantly, right? Again and again. And you and I both know, I think, what that feels like, having inhabited Delhi drawing rooms together. And so I think partly it's that. It's an interesting story around networks, which are very entrenched, right? Based on family, friends, perhaps based on caste, based on job networks. You just see that being replicated and burnished in a way. And so what that means is that your world is very small. And I think that obviously has impact on one's romantic prospects, because at the end of the day, Delhi still is an unsafe city. And many women I know would still feel uncomfortable dating on apps or meeting people through these apps, although it is far more democratic and it's opened up options significantly, because you just don't know what kind of person you will meet. So there's a long process of vetting and being careful and cautious. And so many women I know, and certainly in the book this bears out, they choose to then try and meet people through their own networks and communities, which are incredibly small. So I think that's just how small the Delhi drawing room can feel is, I think, a very important story there. And the second, I think, Milan, is that, I think what's happened following liberalization, and particularly in a city like Delhi, which is a city of opportunity, is that the composition of the elites has changed. So even if all of us are, say the top 10% or even the top 5% of the country, and I write about this in the book, there's a significant gradation there, because the top 5% includes people who are, contractor, tycoon politicians, people who own lots of land and lots of property, and someone like Vidya in my book who's struggling to find a house of her own. She's upper caste, she has the best education, but she's still somewhat of a striver in her own way. And yet all these people went to school together, and from the outside we would think they all bear the same social markers, right? So they seem like they're part of the same milieu. But in fact, there are significant differences of network wealth, of asset wealth between all of these people. And that starts to play out in who settles with whom, who dates whom, who is mingling with whom. And I think that level of how unequal our society can be, even amongst the top 5% and top 10%, finds its way into one's romantic life. But to me, I think the Delhi drawing room as a consequence feels like a very small and suffocating space. And so, in fact, in the chapter on Vidya, I was so pleased to meet her, because it's very rare that you meet people outside those networks. I write in the book that if New York is a city to have wonderful encounters with strangers, in New Delhi, you avoid them in drawing rooms, right? And I think that gives you a sense of what the Delhi drawing room feels like. It's a very small space, highly segregated. And in a way, you're locked in then, you're path dependent on those networks. And then that has implications on your romantic prospects as well, because you're essentially trying to find people within a very small pool, which has all kinds of implications for, feeling frustrated, for not finding the right kind of person. So that's one issue. And I think the other, when it comes to, certainly I think the upper middle class elite women I was speaking to in the book, and I mentioned this, I think, at length, is that there's a sense that with greater economic independence for women, so many of the women that I was speaking to, they hold jobs, they're extremely well educated, aspirational. They're not willing to settle for the kind of man their mother's generation was willing to settle for. And I think Mr. Khan really mirrors that. There's a line, I think Vidya says this to me in the book. She says, my standards are as high as Shah Rukh. And I heard that so often from so many women who are a lot like me, right? From a certain far more privileged background. And what they would constantly say to me is, well, if I can stand on my own 2 feet, and yes, it's a nuisance to be on your own, certainly in Delhi, because it's still, as we said, it's unsafe. There are taxes on women on where you find a house to live on your own and things like that. Typically, these women's parents have also done better for themselves than the generation before, right? And as a consequence, the economic power that they hold to essentially not settle and to refuse to settle is higher. And as a consequence, one sees that playing out in the sort of mating market, because what's happening is these women have aspirations for a Shah Rukh or a man like him, and sort of kind, considerate, progressive, liberal. And yet in their lived experiences, they're finding men who are not comfortable with empowered, independent women. And I think the reason all these women are so frustrated in the mating market is that they constantly feel that men are yet to adapt to how independent they are and their power and the change in femininity. And I think masculinity, even amongst elites, is yet to change that significantly. And I think we're seeing that tension play itself out, certainly in the book, and hence the power of Shah Rukh, right? Because he's sort of this fantastical ideal that probably doesn't exist in real life. And women are seeking that. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of frustration because of this kind of mismatch between what women expect and what men are currently willing and able and socialized to provide.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I want to maybe just set the scene a little bit for our listeners and describe an interaction with the man you called the quote unquote the one. And as I recall, you were in Patna in Bihar on a work trip, and you had come back and you were absolutely famished, but you had a kind of social engagement, a dinner party to go to with the one. And this is what you had to say. As I rushed towards the dinner table for my first cheat meal after becoming a feudal pet, I found all 6 feet 3 inches of the one blocking my path. He gently held my wrist and placed my empty plate down on the table. "You can't eat here," he said, his eyes widening with horror. Puzzled, I asked why, and he looked from the deserted table to the glittering crowd and said, "Only dogs eat in public. Put the plate down. You don't need the food." I think this is about as apt an illustration as one can find about the so-called illiberal views of so-called liberal men. But this also, it seems the way that you tell it kind of pushed you in a sense to write the book, right? Because I don't know if it was, you would describe it as a kind of eureka moment, but the way that the text reads is sort of you kind of devised this plan. Was it that kind of linear?
So Milan, if you recall, right in the beginning, I said around 2013, I was feeling, personally cut up. And certainly I think all of these experiences were encouraging me to, in the tradition of heartbroken, lonely people, to try and find comfort and wisdom in the experiences of others, So I would read books, and then I decided that perhaps the way I would structure the book, my own writing, would be a lot more personal. I don't think it was linear, but I think I mentioned this in the book, this was certainly a time that pushed me to think about playing around with the form and the way the book would be structured, right? So moving away from a very academic form of writing to a much more personal form of writing. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. And yet, what I did want to say about the one, because, at the end of the day, Milan, I'm only able to write about him because he participated and, gave us the green light to go ahead. And I'm very grateful for that. Is that, as I started to look through that experience, I also realized that at some level, and this is that crisis of masculinity I was talking about, because if you look at his background, and I write about this at length in the book, he comes from an aristocratic family, very used to always getting his way, right? And these are men who operate in a world where everybody says yes to them all the time. And, I say in the book that, they're taught to be charming, but not sincere. And suddenly, because of the social churn in Delhi, which allows for someone like him to meet someone like me. And this is what I was saying to you earlier about, how small the Delhi drawing room is usually. But if once in a while there are these sudden chance encounters from people who don't really belong to each other's worlds, which is actually, I think, quite a remarkable thing. I also think he just had no idea how to handle the expectations and my own sort of expectations and attributes. And so I think, this is this mismatch again of what young men are taught to do and expect from women. And I think looking back, I should have sort of, read the tea leaves a bit earlier, but I didn't. And, one sort of goes through life and then you learn and then you move forward. And I'm very grateful for what happened, because you're absolutely right. I think it changed the way I was thinking about the way the book would be structured. Having said that, though, I will also add that when I look back, I also realize, and I mentioned this in the book, that he had multiple partners. There was a way he was navigating his romantic life. But it was far more honest, Milan, than many of the other men that I knew, as well as other women in the book, my own friends knew, who again, would on the surface seem like honest, decent, liberal men. And, none of us are sexual Puritans. And, there's a character in the book who actually says, there's nothing wrong with playing the field, but play the field with honesty. And, I think the difference between a New Delhi and a New York is precisely this, which is that I think men as well feel that they need to hide a lot of what they're doing. And the social sanction, of course, to play the field is granted to men, and men feel far more masculine when they play the field and all of that. There are trappings of masculinity there. And yet, because we are still a very conservative society, there's a very messy way in which men are dealing with their own desires. And I think women end up feeling really shortchanged. And the one thing I will say when I look back, despite the illiberal views and just the complete mismatch between his world and mine, I will say that I think there was a far more honest appreciation of just the way he was handling his own life, because he was very clear about it with me right from the start, and I write about this in the book, which really wasn't the case with many other men who were very excited to suddenly have different romantic options and opportunities to pursue. And yet they wouldn't do it with, what I think many of us would call emotional hygiene, just being honest and direct with the different people in your life.
I want to ask you a little bit about solutions, right? At the end of the day, you are an economist, so you think about things often in policy terms. And you note in the book towards the latter part that, there aren't really any technocratic answers to this set of issues that you unearth. That instead what's needed are intimate revolutions at home. And I really like that phrase, intimate revolutions. You said we need families, friends, loved ones to stop imposing taxes on women's desires for achievement that they might win outside of the home. We are paraded with pretty dismal statistics, as you know better than anyone, on female labor force participation. There's a big debate about why is it so low? Is it actually declining? And so on and so forth. And we think a lot about, okay, how do we work on labor demand? How do we think on labor supply? What are the policy levers? But you're saying that there's really something deeper going on that may be less mutable to say government forces or external intervention. How would you diagnose this?
Milan, one of the things that I was very committed to, in fact, in the book to present is that social change is intimate and it's incremental. Feminists have always known, Milan, that the true home of social change in any institution, structure, country, society is intimacy and our everyday social relationships, right? And the book is trying to give you a flavor of what starts to happen when women push for more freedom within their homes and their intimate spaces, and how the economy actually helps or doesn't help that process. And the economy is shaping that process constantly, be it access to jobs, be it access to media, markets, money, so on and so forth. And to me, and I write this in the book, and in fact, many of the characters and people in the book who I've interviewed say this, which is that even if we had the best infrastructure, the best programs, if families and loved ones do not support women in their choices and constantly berate them or make them feel unworthy for wanting to do things that defy standard social scripts of just getting married or motherhood, women stepping out of the home will actually only create more of a mental health crisis and a level of stress for women, which most women would not want to bear. And so I do believe the real lever of change, of course, policies are important, so be it transport vouchers, be it making it easy to access information for women, right, on jobs, on skilling programs, and so on. But all of that, my sense is, Milan, I do think it's amenable to change. And I think in the book, you see all these women are able to negotiate very different equilibriums for themselves through a very complex set of bargains and negotiations. But I think the change will require us to think about involving civil society for counseling families, acknowledging the home, particularly, Milan, as a workplace. So, and that has very different policy dimensions, right? I know recently you have a symposium that's come out and you talk about urban settlements. And I think it's interesting that if we start to acknowledge the home as a productive workplace, and in fact, most women in India are working from home, then perhaps the government should think about investing in childcare more credibly and seriously, making domestic drudgery an actual goal to reduce. So make access to water, access to heating much easier, appliances, making just the labor of cooking, cleaning, all of these things much easier. And also invest in ensuring tenure security for women who are essentially creating their own independent livelihoods from their own homes, right? Be it manufacturing or other kinds of jobs. And so I'm hopeful. I think that a lot of these policies can move us in the right direction, but they need to also be met with, peer effects, peer-to-peer counseling, thinking about models where you can actually have NGOs perhaps out there counseling families as women start to take on jobs. And I think there are RCTs that actually show that, as you start to provide these kinds of counseling supports and peer-to-peer networks, you suddenly start to see improved agency and voice and access to jobs, and for at least a certain period of time. And maybe it can't sustain itself. And then thinking credibly, not just giving lip service to elderly care and to child care and, water and sort of domestic infrastructure, right? The infrastructure of care, but to credibly do so. And right now we don't spend enough, and the quality of that spending is poor. And so I'm hopeful, but I think we have to not look at factories and fields. When we think about women's experiences of the economy, we have to think about the home as a productive space. And once we start to do that, I think we will change the way, I think the gaze that even technocrats have on solving this crisis around women and jobs. And the second, as I said, is that it needs to be complemented with very serious thought on how we involve civil society and communities in thinking about counseling families who remain utterly reluctant, certainly in the North, even in the West. Of India, to let women just migrate out, right, to find a house or to find a job. And so I think, combined with shelter support, transport, access to information, I think peer-to-peer networks and community involvement will be absolutely key in pushing this forward. But having said all that, Milan, I think there's still a part of this puzzle which will never be technocratic, and it can't be solved by policy, which is in the personal domain, because each one of us, when we do things that our loved ones don't really want us to do, be it because of social scripts, there's a certain loneliness that you bear because of it. And I think the book is a study of that loneliness and how that's being structured. So I think things like, friendship, social networks, that form of support will be absolutely vital. And I think the book is, you called it a call to arms, Milan. I think it's actually a call to arms also for more introspection and for all of us to think very carefully about the way we are taxing our own loved ones and in our own lives, right? Be it the one to me or me to my domestic worker or anyone else, right? These intimate everyday interactions that we have. I think that is really the home of social change. And so while governments and technocrats and, political scientists and economists and sociologists can think about wonderful solutions and technical fixes, and I'm very hopeful on those have to be complemented with our own resolve. And I think that can only happen in our everyday social lives. And to me, the book is actually just an effort to try and nudge us in that direction.
So, Shrayana, let me kind of conclude by kind of circling back to Shah Rukh. You mentioned early in this conversation that Shah Rukh has always been seen as the more quote-unquote Muslim of the trio of Khans in his public persona. And I'm wondering how you reflect on his stature, on his relevance, on his popularity in India circa 2021, when we are at a time of such heightened communal polarization, salience of social divisions is running very high. Is there still a place for Shah Rukh in, what maybe post liberalization India?
as long as people feel lonely and people are looking for fun and comfort, and as long as people are marginalized, there'll always be a space for Mr. Khan. And Milan, you only need to look at the experiences of the past month to realize just the sheer volume of support he received, right, through that entire crisis, which is really shameful. There were people lining up outside his house in support of him. I saw fan clubs essentially trying to, raise their voices. So many prominent journalists, and it's interesting, so many of them were women, came out in support for him. Everyone seemed to have a Shah Rukh story, which I thought was incredibly endearing. And, the power of an icon is his ability to allow us to tell stories about ourselves. And I think Mr. Khan will always be salient to an India where people want to tell stories about themselves, and they will always use him as a marker, be it because of nostalgia. He has had a career of 30 years. He's essentially marked people's birthdays, marriages, personal stories and lives. There are men and women who've proposed to each other because of his films. There are all kinds of stories there, incredibly charming ones and heartwarming ones. And I think as a result, his power is evergreen. I actually say this in the book, and the book was obviously written before all of this occurred over the past few months. In the book, one of the things that I mentioned very clearly is that his icon is liberated from this need to be linked to the news cycle or just his box office collections. Because, just like the Beatles, there were good songs, bad songs, but the Beatles will be the Beatles and Shah Rukh will always be Shah Rukh, precisely because people always need that space, right? The North Star, as you said, people need space to articulate and reflect on their own lives, and he offers that function for them.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Shrayana Bhattacharya. She is the author of the brand new book published by HarperCollins, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence. Shrayana, congratulations on the book. There is something in this book truly for everyone, whether you are a Bollywood fan or Bollywood ignoramus like myself. Congrats on the book, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan. It was such a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest-growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.